Hello, everybody. Today, we have a hot topic on Autoimmune Table Talk. Today's topic is going to be, what is LPS? What the heck is LPS? What does it have to do with infection? And thus yet, what does it have to do with autoimmunity? Here we go. Hey, everybody. Today, we're here with Kiran Krishnan, and I'm going to let him introduce himself shortly. But first, I want to answer that hot topic question. What the heck is LPS?
So LPS is a compound that's generated within your body. So we call it an endotoxin. So it's not something you can get away from. It's generated within your body, and it is the biggest driver of mortality and morbidity worldwide. There was a very clear 2015 publication in the Frontiers of Immunology that showed that misdirected LPS, getting into the wrong places of the body, is the biggest driver of chronic disease worldwide, including autoimmune conditions. So if we're not paying attention to this, we really cannot make any progress on our autoimmune conditions.
Yeah. And this is huge because a lot of people with autoimmunity understand that they're at much higher risk for infection, but they don't understand necessarily how this infection autoimmunity is linked and why that means that they would have an elevated level of LPS and what the implications of that is. So that's what we're going to be here to talk about today. I'm Maggie Yu MD. I am a functional and holistic medicine physician and the creator of the Transform Protocol to help turn around any autoimmune disease around naturally. And Kiran, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. So I'm Kiran Krishnan. I'm a research microbiologist with a heavy focus on the last 10, 15 years in the human microbiome and how the gut microbiome and other biomes, all the microbes in and around us, how they impact our overall health. And best of all, what are the healing opportunities within this powerful ecosystem of microbes in order to improve our outcomes?
I always say, Kiran, something about a lot of people with autoimmunity or any sort of chronic disease, they themselves or their providers will focus in on infection. And they'll focus in on identifying the infection, killing the infection as their first step.
Yeah.
And I loved attending the recent conference that you put up. And I learned so much. I mean, I'm constantly learning. And that's the reason why I invited you here, because so much of what you had to say based on the latest research around infection and LPS, I think is really helpful for the people dealing with chronic disease or autoimmune disease. And I think that we have I call it order of operations problem.
Yeah.
Meaning that I feel like it's always like people are going from the back end dealing with infection when there's all this stuff that leads up to it that nobody does anything about. And then if you never change that underlying environment, it just basically is like saying, hey, go away, come back, welcome, come back, welcome, come back. So we got people with autoimmune disease and chronic disease who's in the circular corridor. So I kind of want to get into that. But before we do, let's deep dive more into LPS.
Yeah.
So let's go through, how is LPS created?
Yeah. So LPS stands for lipopolysaccharide. Now, what that actually means, it's basically a carbohydrate head, and it has these long fatty acid tails, right? That's the structure of LPS. It's actually made by bacteria, by these types of bacteria called gram-negative bacteria. Every bacteria in the world is either gram-negative or gram-positive. What that means is that if they have a cell wall structure, there's a process in microbiology, in very basic microbiology, where you can stain the bacteria. And when you look at it under a microscope, it either picks up the stain or it doesn't pick up the stain. If it picks up the stain, it means it has a cell wall, and the wall gets stained, and that means it's gram-positive. If it doesn't pick up the stain, it doesn't have a cell wall, it has a cell membrane instead, which is different, so it becomes gram-negative. Now, these gram-negative bacteria, and not all of them are bad. That's a common misconception. There's many perfectly fine commensal gram-negative bacteria that aren't infectious in that way, but all gram-negative bacteria produce this LPS. Now, it's a compound that the bacteria themselves use for many reasons. They use it for adhesion. That's how they stick to things in some cases. They use it for communication with other microbes. So they have many uses for it. It's a compound that sticks through their membrane. And when it's in the bacteria, sticking in the membrane, it doesn't really cause any problems. And about half the microbes, or a little bit more, that live in your system, both in your GI tract, in your mouth, on your skin, everywhere else, are gram-negative bacteria. So at least half of the 40 to 50 trillion bacteria that live in your system make this lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. Now, when it's not in the membrane of the bacteria, it becomes what we call an endotoxin, because it is highly toxigenic when it's not sticking in the membrane of the bacteria. And so bacteria die constantly all over your body, inside your gut and the rest of your body. Every time this gram-negative bacteria dies, it releases the LPS, so it's free on its own. Yeah. And if that LPS gets to the wrong parts of the body, it can trigger massive inflammatory responses. So that's LPS in a nutshell, and that's why it's called an endotoxin. It's a toxin that's created within the body. We can't get away from it. Compare that to an exotoxin, like a mold toxin, for example. You know, that you might have a moldy home and you can try to get away from that home to escape the toxin. This is an endotoxin that's within.
I'd love for people who are watching right now, if you have a question for Kiran or for myself, if you could post in the comments, that'd be great. For anybody that's currently in our programs, if you could let people know why you're in the program and what are some results that you have already experienced, or some of the solutions. If you could type it in chat, that'd be really great. I love to talk with you, not at you. So the more of you that can comment, the better. And I'm going to ask a question here. How many of you know for a fact you're dealing with an infection anywhere in your body, and it is a major trigger of your autoimmunity? Type it in chat, because a lot of people think it's just about gut infection. And I can tell you right now, LPS can happen from urinary tract infection, sinus infection, dental. Specifically for me, I think sinus, throat, and dental is huge for people with autoimmunity, and it's hidden. People even ignore those results in a stool study test, oftentimes calling it commensal, like meaning that's normal. But it's so interesting to me that the autoimmune population, Kiran, has a really high level of these dental, throat, and sinus. And I mean, I know you guys are also looking at vaginal flora as well.
We are, yeah. And keep in mind that the vaginal canal is very susceptible to the presence of gram-negative bacteria, because it's close to the anus, right? So there's lots of fecal bacteria that move in there, and a predominance of fecal bacteria like E. coli tends to be gram-negative. Same thing in the mouth. Enterococcus, E. coli, all of these organisms that inhabit the mouth are all gram-negative. They have direct access to your blood through your gums, right? It's the soft tissue in the mouth. It has lots of capillary beds, bleeds easily, as we all know, when we brush and floss. So there's lots of ways for that gram-negative bacteria to get that LPS into your system. And of course, there's a very, very common one that the majority of adults are infected with, that maybe we don't think about enough, and that's Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori, which infects your stomach lining. And at least 50% of adults are infected with infectious levels of it.
And it's much higher for people with autoimmunity.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's lots of correlations there, because what happens with that is it infects the lining of your stomach, right? And it creates these holes, holes, if you will, and permeability in the lining of your stomach. And then it secretes LPS into circulation through the lining of the stomach. And it is a gram-negative bacteria. And so, compare that to gram-negative bacteria in your intestines that secrete LPS into your circulation. In your intestines, about 80-85% of the circulation goes to the liver first. So the liver is taking a big hit, right? Trying to deal with these toxins coming in from the stomach. It goes directly into circulation. And so, at the end of the day, you've got lots and lots of this endotoxin circulating throughout your body. It can lodge itself in many different tissues where it can trigger an inflammatory response. That inflammatory response can be the onset of an autoimmune response in that region, or it can circulate around and create a systemic inflammatory response, which can also be the foundation trigger of autoimmunity.
You know what I think is also missing from the conversation, Kiran, is digestion. One of the things in my experience, having dealt with my own autoimmune experience the last 20 years and helping people through it, is that I feel like digestion is like the missing holy grail in understanding infection. If you have poor digestion, that's your first barrier of defense against infection. And there was a recent study that actually showed that people with autoimmune disease, 90% of them already have low stomach acid, which is only one step in digestion. And
Yep.
if you think about just that stomach acid and what it does to kill microbes, we use
Exactly.
vinegar to kill microbes.
Yeah.
And so if 90% of people with autoimmune disease already genetically have low, stomach acid, then it goes to show that there's a reason why they're getting infected with all this bacteria at a higher rate.
Yep. Yeah, and there's two really important points to what you bring up there with the low stomach acid. So number one, low stomach acid allows for H. pylori to breed, right?
Mhm.
So you can have higher levels of Helicobacter pylori, which is a big source of this LPS and a big source of systemic inflammation. Low stomach acid facilitates that. The other thing that low stomach acid does is it allows more gram-negative bacteria from the mouth, which is loaded
Yeah.
gram-negative bacteria, to survive through and colonize in your intestines, causing things like SIBO, for example.
Yep.
SIBO, a big source of the dysfunctional bacteria that overgrows in your small bowel, comes from your mouth, because we swallow billions and billions of microbes every single day through saliva. Your stomach acid is supposed to kill all those microbes so that they're not viable when they enter your system. But if your stomach acid is low, and especially if on top of that you've been using things like proton pump inhibitors and acids and all that, right?
Don't get us started about that. How many people out there on proton pump inhibitors or Prilosec right now?
Common OTCs out there, right?
Mhm.
It used to be a prescription, which took a little bit more work to get, but now they're just over the counter. Anyone can go buy them.
So people have heartburn and they don't understand what's causing the heartburn, which is low stomach acid or infection or food sensitivities. And then they just put a Band-Aid on it, which shuts down your stomach acid, which makes you ripe for infection.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And, one of the things you mentioned earlier when we first started was about the cycle of continuous infections, because we keep trying to go after the core organism that may be causing the infection or driving the infectious process without really the thought around the environment and the terrain, right?
Right.
Nothing prevents an infectious bacteria from growing better than competitive commensal bacteria.
Yeah.
Right. They do a better job of controlling the bad guys than we do targeting the bad guys. Because in all our efforts to target the bad guys, we are inevitably going to reduce the growth of the good commensal bacteria who we need to target the bad guys. Right. So this becomes cyclical. And we see this with Helicobacter pylori infections, with continuous gut infections, even things like C. diff and other infections that we know of, where we continue to use these agents to try to kill them, and they just keep reoccurring because we're not really taking care of the environment, the terrain, which we call our microbiome.
Well, let's talk a little bit about solutions, because we'll go back to SIBO. I think that's an interesting topic, as a lot of people don't realize, as you teach, is that a lot of these gram-negative organisms sitting in the stomach and small intestine is what's causing all these SIBO infections, all the gas production, the discomfort, the symptoms. We mentioned that there's a digestion component of this, and then it's also bacteria sometimes in the wrong place, like in the stomach, a small intestine. But from a digestion standpoint, you also, from your line, I do want to talk about MegaGuard. Like, in our line, we have Digestion, which helps people with every step of digestion. But to me, MegaGuard is very interesting because it's that whole Wadsworthia that you're talking about. It's probably, I would love for you to just even key in on that piece of digestion and why that particular product really does address some of these issues with people with recurrent SIBO.
Yeah. One big component of that is the ability of your body's ability to utilize bile. Right. So bile is incredibly important because bile is an antimicrobial on its own. And one of the reasons why we have bile is, of course, we know that bile helps us absorb fat-based nutrients. We also know that bile helps neutralize and bind up toxins that are coming in, takes it to the liver, of course, to clean out. But another very, very important function of bile is to neutralize overgrowing organisms during the digestion process, right? And so bile acts as an antimicrobial itself, controlling microbial growth during the digestive process. But then it also does a second thing. Bile gets recycled through the digestive tract when you're eating up to 15 times, where your gallbladder stores the bile and then it releases it into the small intestine. The bile moves through the small intestine, gets reabsorbed at the end of the small intestine, goes to the liver, gets cleaned up in the liver, gets re-secreted into the gallbladder, and then gets secreted again into the small intestine, right? So that cycle can happen over 15 times during the process of eating a meal. Now, one of the very important steps in that is right before bile gets reabsorbed, at the very end of the small intestine, it triggers a receptor called a nuclear FX receptor. That receptor causes all of your intestinal cells in your small bowel to release antimicrobial compounds to control microbial growth in the small bowel. So you don't have an overgrowth of things like gram-negative bacteria that are coming in from your mouth, from food, and so on, right? Because your body is desperately trying to control growth of microbes in the small intestine. The small intestine should not be a place where you have very high microbial levels. It's very susceptible to leakiness because the membranes and the permeability in the small intestine tend to be quite high because you're trying to absorb nutrients through there. And so your body has a permeable membrane in the small intestine to begin with. And so it doesn't want huge numbers of microbes. The small intestine from a volume standpoint is relatively small. So your body doesn't want microbes in there causing a lot of fermentation and so on, which produces gases and all that disrupt the system, creates bloating, distension, inflammation, and so on. So the process of utilization of bile is really important in controlling microbial overgrowth in the small bowel. And MegaGuard really helps with that. MegaGuard has a component in it, which is actually in Germany, is a prescription product for ensuring adequate bile secretion from the gallbladder. It also ensures adequate gastric emptying, which is where you don't want the food to sit too long in your stomach because it can start to get putrefied, right? And the putrefaction can cause more gas, bloating, inflammation, and so on. So it helps the emptying of the food bolus into the small intestine, more secretion of the bile, and then a help in moving that food through the system. So, and that is the most common digestive issue in people, right? Gastroparesis, gastritis, reflux, right? These are the most common.
And how often do we see those symptoms for people with autoimmune disease? I mean, we're getting people diagnosed with gastroparesis all the time as if that's like an untreatable problem, when to me and you, it's clearly a digestion problem. We solve gastroparesis for breakfast.
Right.
Because we actually know something about digestion. When you address the underlying digestive issues, 90% of these symptoms can go away. They're not permanent problems.
Exactly. They should never be. Yeah, because these aren't like, I mean, rarely is this a genetic issue that it can't be changed, or there's some inherent protein defect and so on, like complicated things. Most of this is an ecological issue with the microbiome, and then a nutrient issue with missing certain key nutrients in your diet over time and so on. So a lot of these things can be significantly helped with some simple steps.
Well, let's go back to the conversation about commensal organisms.
Yeah.
Because one of the solutions you guys just learned is deal with your digestion. Number one, you have a product like our Digested, which covers every step of digestion. But for populations who's really working on clearing, let's say SIBO or certain types of gut infections, adding something like MegaGuard or using a product like MegaGuard can be helpful because it really thins the bile to help the bile, like when it squeezes, it drains that area. It actually expels not just the bile acids, but also the bacteria with it. That prevents reinfection over and over again through the bile, right? So digestion is really key. Number two, let's talk about commensal organisms. Can you explain what commensal organisms are?
Sure. The word commensal actually means to eat with. So these are organisms that exist naturally within your system. Keep in mind that we have more microbes than anything else in our body. We have more microbial cells than human cells. We have far more microbial DNA. We have about 150 times more microbial DNA than human DNA in our system. And so we have lots and lots of organisms that we're born with that we end up harboring for the rest of our lives. And they play a very, very important role in our functionality. these organisms are considered commensal because we eat and feed with these organisms, and they control the egregious organisms. That's the best way of controlling these organisms. So even if you look in the outside world, right, which makes it a little easier to understand, the places with some of the highest risks of picking up really significant infections are the most sterile places, right? Places like hospital, right? Right? The places where they use the most significant amount of cleaners and all to try to sterilize things. That's where you have the highest risk of picking up infections. It's easier to pick up a drug-resistant bacterial strain in a hospital than it is going out
rolling in dirt.
Exactly, right? Because the woods and the dirt and all that have a very diverse set of microbes, and the microbes are really good at controlling and competing with other microbes, with egregious microbes. I did an article for U.S. News and World Report a long time ago. They had asked to interview me about this whole idea of drug-resistant strains and this diminishing microbiome. And for that article, I did a calculation around the percent of microorganisms that are actually harmful to us, right? That can cause disease. And based on a kind of a cursory calculation on the literature that exists around this topic, I concluded that it was about 0.1% or less of all microbes discovered were actually harmful, right? Which means 99.9% are either benign or friendly, right? But we put so much emphasis on that 0.1% all the time. And we have all these agents, these cleaning agents and antimicrobials and drugs and antibiotics and all to go after the 0.1%, when one of the best ways to control them is to allow the 99.9% to flourish. And so that 99.9% are your commensals. And so if you're conducting behaviors that really support your commensals, then it makes your system much harder to infect and invade.
So, in our program, one of the things I really think about, we think about keystone. We've talked about in the past, keystone species. And then we also just think about diversity with a lot of different types of bacteria. In our program, we rotate multiple probiotics. I like a variety and I also think that we're getting more and more towards targeted probiotic therapy for certain conditions as well. But one of the things we've added has been a spore probiotic into the rotation.
Right.
I wanted for you to explain how and why people should consider adding Megaspore. Where does Megaspore come from? How does it increase diversity uniquely compared to other probiotics?
Yeah. So spores are very, very interesting category of probiotics. They do some very specific things that a lot of other probiotics don't do. So they're a nice complement to other probiotics that you may be taking. So let's talk about in nature how you would encounter a spore, right? And what the role of a spore is. A spore-forming probiotic is basically a probiotic bacteria that can cover itself in a calcified protein-like armor when it's not in its ideal growth environment, right? So if it's a commensal spore, meaning it's a spore that lives naturally in the human gut, the moment it leaves the human gut through defecation, it's going to cover itself in the spore coat. And it can remain dormant outside of the body for upwards of 50 million years, right? Some of the oldest spores that have been found are 50 million years old, sitting in salt crystals in caves, ancient caves, and they can extract the spores out and still grow them, despite them being so old. They've been sitting there dormant, waiting to be consumed. And so they sit there dormant, waiting to be consumed. They're in the outside environment. You consume them. That armor-like coating allows them to survive past the gastric system. The moment they get into the small intestine, they realize that they're in there because they have these membrane structures that stick out of the spore to recognize the environment. So when they recognize that they're in the intestines, they come out of the spore state, and then they start flourishing in the gut. Now, one of the very first important things that they do in the gut is something called quorum sensing, where they read the microbial environment. They can read all the different bacteria's chemical signature to understand what microbes are there. and at what levels even, right? So they can identify the presence of pathogenic organisms, they can identify the presence of opportunistic organisms, and they can identify the presence of beneficial organisms. Now, if they see that the pathogens or the opportunistic organisms are too high, they'll go and they'll sit next to or surround those organisms. They'll produce compounds to limit the growth of those organisms, or they'll fight with those organisms for space and nutrients. So they're really, really effective at bringing down the levels of opportunistic and pathogenic organisms highly specifically without damaging anything else. Now, at the same time, they also produce compounds that feed some of our keystone bacteria and our commensal organisms to regrow those organisms to a higher level. So they completely reorchestrate and rebalance the microbiome. We know, I'll give you a really brilliant example of both of these. One, the competitive, what we call competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion is the ability of one microbe to exclude or eliminate another microbe, right? So the spores are very strong competitive exclusion agents. So we've published, I think, 2 studies now with Cleveland Clinic on the ability of those spores, for example, to compete with Clostridium difficile. And we know Clostridium difficile is a very difficult, complicated infection in people. And what they were able to show in this publication is that they can administer the spores in Megaspore. They will go in, our spores will identify Clostridia, it'll surround it, and it will actually steal iron and other minerals away from the Clostridia, starving it to death. Right. So it does so in such an amazing, intelligent way. And at the same time, we've published studies showing that when you add the spores in, it increases a keystone species 10 to 100-fold in growth. So these are the gut orchestrators, if you will. They'll get in there and start shifting the balance of microbes in an important way. Oh, I can't hear you, Maggie.
It's so fascinating to me that we are educating people about infection. Everybody wants to talk about infection. And we've talked about how digestion is really important. We've talked about how having commensal organisms that, in there, including a spore probiotic, is really important. These are actionable things that you can do right now. We also have questions coming in right now. We've got anybody with questions, if you can post in chat right now, that'll be really great. Teresa has a question. And I get this all the time where people say, what if I don't have a gallbladder? And to me, that's really simple. If you don't have a gallbladder, I think it's a travesty how many gallbladders we remove.
Absolutely.
It's ridiculous. To me, someone gets a gallbladder removal, they get a surgical answer to an underlying inability to digest fat and have proper gallbladder contraction. And so instead of helping the digestion, you go to a surgeon and they say, let's just remove your gallbladder. And that removes an organ that's crucial to fat digestion. And then they do nothing about it, which means that you have very little ability to actually properly digest your fat without a gallbladder. So people without gallbladder even need more digestion support.
Yeah.
They
absolutely do. And that I think it is one of those tragic examples of how there can be all this hubris in medicine where it's like, oh, something's wrong with this part, let's just cut it out, right? Let's not pay attention to the fact that the gallbladder has survived millions of years of evolution, which clearly means it's important to the system to function. And keep in mind, that means you're not excreting bile, you're not digesting fat, you're not absorbing fat-based nutrients, you're not sequestering fat-based toxins to take it to the liver to be excreted out of the body. You're not having that antimicrobial effect from bile that we talked about, and you're not triggering that nuclear FXR receptor, which also causes your small intestine to excrete antimicrobials to reduce microbial growth. Now, what can you do about it? I would suggest someone consider supplementing with ox bile, for example, in their diet, because you need bile. Bile is so critical. It's if your gallbladder is not functioning properly, there are things you can do. Like MegaGuard has these extracts that help the gallbladder release bile a bit better. There are microbiome components of a dysfunctional gallbladder as well. But if you have none, you should consider ox bile as a supplementation, so you get some bile
Well,
in your system.
and that's the thing for me. I mean, one of the reasons why digestive for us is, our top selling product, to be honest, and the most rebought. And the reason is because I think to me, just even the first step of digestion, which is low stomach acid, 90% of people with autoimmune disease have.
Mhm.
So, and then you add on top of it gallbladder problems, people with gallbladder removal, not to even mention genetic pancreatic enzyme deficiency. And then the last step of digestion, I think, is fermentation with your bacteria. So
Yeah.
there's all these different steps in digestion. So for me, digested covers like 90% of those steps. Right. So digested, I have everybody in our program. It's a must. If they take one with small meals, two with big meals, it contains the ox bile to
Mhm.
actually digest. So for me, if you don't have a gallbladder, it becomes even more crucial to support the steps of digestion. What I have people even do is if they do digest it and they feel like it relieves all their symptoms with digestion, great. If it doesn't, they may be one of those people that don't have a gallbladder or have zero fat digestion. They add ox bile on top of it.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
another way to do that. So it's just literally food for thought with digestion. But there's multiple ways with which even, and that's the thing is, especially if you don't have a gallbladder, you need digestion support even more.
Yeah.
And then
Right.
let's talk about the environment.
Mhm.
And because that to me is the most important thing to do. And that's what the whole Transform program is really about. People like are always on the back end. I have all these questions here on people talking about Lyme or SIBO, or like I have Candida. And it's like, how do I kill it? How do I kill it? I almost sometimes feel like it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
It really is a waste of time and mental energy to sit here talking about how to kill it on this end, because you're just going to get it back.
Totally.
I mean, what's the recurrence rate of SIBO? What's the recurrence rate of Candida? Do you know what is the recurrence rate of SIBO right now?
I mean, it's well in the 80%.
Staggering.
Yeah, it's
And
staggering.
these are people through thousands of dollars of antibiotics.
And every cycle of killing to try to get rid of it actually makes you more susceptible to the recurrence, because you're damaging the environment even more after that, right? So it's just it's a fruitless process of trying to go through continuous rounds of antibiotics, antimicrobials to try to get rid of it, because it doesn't happen that way.
Well, and then I see Amy who brought up this question, and she's talking about do we need to avoid foods that stimulate bile, etc., bacterial growth? And so, what does the role of food have to do with our environment?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, exactly. So, when you think about it, it's really about, are you eating the right things to feed the commensals, right?
yeah,
Is your food supporting a diverse ecosystem? And that's a real crux of it all. And to me, one of the real sad things to see when people have severe digestive issues is they go through process of elimination, right? So it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking the number of things that you eat.
It's staggeringly terrible.
It is, and there are people that end up eating 4 different kinds of foods, and that's the only 4 things they can handle.
Yeah.
And now your commensals aren't getting the basic nutrients they need, so their numbers start to go down.
Right.
The overgrowing or infectious elements start to go up.
Yeah.
Because it's easier for them to grow.
Yeah.
And the problem continues to persist. And in fact, it drives even more intolerance, which makes you eat even fewer foods.
100%.
Right? It's just a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle. And that's to me why food mapping, in our program, we do a unique process, food mapping, where we actually use your blown blood work to have very accurate data on exactly, number one, which food allergies or sensitivities you have that's triggering it. You remove it. But what people find is like, when you're looking at the typical, Kiran, when you're looking at the typical elimination diet, people are eliminating 20 to 30%, if not up to like 90% of foods in their diet.
Yeah.
When you have a targeted list, and many people find it's like 2 things, it's broccoli and sesame or something. Mm-hmm. And then what most people find after going through food mapping in the program is they're actually reintroducing a shit ton of food, which is wonderful because they're getting all these different macro, micronutrients, phytonutrients for the bacteria in their gut to actually grow. So for me, number one, how do you clean up your diet? You got to do food mapping, proper testing and understanding of those test results, especially for someone with autoimmune disease. What I found is a lot of people with autoimmune disease have false positive or false negatives when it comes to these testing. So if you don't, as a physician and as the client, understand what these are, then you're still getting data that's misinterpreted. So you don't understand what the right things to move. And then you say it doesn't work. So that's where food mapping, number one, is really different. But number two is I think people lack an understanding also of what is the macronutrient makeup that really feeds commensal bacteria.
Right.
Like, so I find that, blood sugar mastery, which is the second pillar of our program, I always tell people, I'm like, everybody comes in, I would say 50% of people come in saying, oh, my blood sugar is fine. And through the process of educating them, we actually go through and we talk about, and they learn actually what is the proper balance of fat, protein, fiber in the form of prebiotic that actually feeds this good bacteria. And do you want to talk a second about prebiotics? Because some people are talking about taking prebiotics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, many of your commensals survive largely on prebiotics. Now, of course, if we were, 1,000 years ago and we're eating as hunter-gatherer, forager type people, and we were eating the way our ancestors did, which was upwards of 600 different types of foods annually, we'd be getting tons of prebiotics in our diet, right? We'd be eating roots and tubers and nuts and seeds and fruits and the intestinal tract of ruminant animals and so on. So we'd be getting all kinds of prebiotic fibers into our system, and that's part of how our microbiome evolved, because we ate so many different types of macronutrients that we don't have the capability of digesting. So it went on to feed the microbes in the system, right? And we get very, very little prebiotic in our diets these days because prebiotics in processed foods are not functional compounds, right? They don't bind water the way other things do. They don't provide the caking capability and all that. So they're not used functionally in processed foods, and a lot of people today eat processed foods. They're also not the easiest to get to in your diet, right? Because it's harder to get a resistant starch into your diet than it is to get a simple starch and a simple sugar into your diet, right? So access to these things and know-how and intelligence around it is difficult as well. So getting prebiotics into your system is absolutely critical, because that's what the vast majority of your commensals need, right? They need those non-digestible polysaccharides, those non-digestible, soluble and insoluble fibers, those resistant starches. Those are the things that they absolutely need. In fact, that's the first food that your microbiome had. Mother's milk, mammalian milk is the only food that's been perfected through the course of evolution, right? It's the only food. And that food still exists today. Women still make milk in part because of how important it is for establishing the microbiome. Some people have heard of HMO, or milk-derived oligosaccharides, right? About 30% of the volume of mother's milk are prebiotic oligosaccharides that the baby can't even digest for energy. It's there purely to seed your commensal bacteria.
Cool.
Right? So it becomes so important for us as adults in practice to be consuming adequate amounts of prebiotics, fibers, and so on in our diet, because that's a key thing that feeds the commensals. One very interesting piece of data, and this speaks to the importance of fibers and prebiotics into your diet. We all know that there's lots and lots of people that are gluten sensitive, right? That have massive inflammatory effects when they eat gluten. And so there was this big study that came out that was kind of counterintuitive, but it tells a special message that one has to tease out a little bit, right? So here's what the study showed. In the first year, after people go on a gluten-free diet, so these are gluten-sensitive people, their mortality rates go way up, right? Their mortality rates from heart disease almost double. Their mortality rates from cancer almost double. So the mortality rates in general go way up. And you think, wait, that makes no sense, because gluten is super inflammatory to them, right? And so they're removing this inflammatory food. Why would their mortality rates go way up? Well, and the reason, as it turns out, is because in the Western society, more than 85 to 90%
That's
of
so
all
good.
fiber intake comes from wheat, right? So if you go gluten-free, you're basically eliminating fiber from your diet without putting any other fiber back
So
in.
good.
And it just shows the importance of fiber in that case, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
your system, if you were gluten sensitive and you were eating gluten all this time, it means your system is inflamed, your gut is leaky, you've got all kinds of damage going on in your GI tract. On top of that, if you eliminate fiber from your diet, it just shows how susceptible you are to further damage and that the system won't heal on its own, right? It
Yeah.
just eliminating stuff is not a healing process.
It is not a healing process.
And so that's, so we can't emphasize that enough, that in order to heal, you need to be able to figure out what your triggers are, go through a mapping process like you've created, and then start adding back in foods that are going to feed the system, feed
Yep.
the Commensals, and provide the healing.
Well, I think that's the key. People don't realize that probably 80% of what we do is helping people reintroduce more foods back.
Yeah.
People think food mapping, which is our process, is like eliminating more food. And you can ask like 80, 90%. Those of you who are alumni here in the chat, if you can tell people, what have you been able to reintroduce as a result of food mapping? Type it in chat. I just had someone yesterday who was able to reintroduce all dairy products back because he learned that it was actually not an allergy or a sensitivity, but it was lactose intolerance, digestion problem, not an allergy problem. So if you take the enzyme to help you digest it, he could actually eat it again.
That's awesome.
Voila, right? Okay, to wrap things up, I do want to point out, people are going to say, what does LPS have to do with, specifically for me? I have autoimmune disease. People are asking, I have rheumatoid arthritis. What is this? Someone said, I have a rheumatoid arthritis. I have Hashimoto's. I don't care what your diagnosis is. It could be Sjogren's, lupus, all autoimmune disease. Why should we care about LPS, which is the high amount of infection LPS in our bodies?
Yeah. So a couple of things. Number one, keep in mind that inflammation is the soup in which autoimmune diseases breed, right? So if you have systemic inflammation or inflammatory triggers, that's what triggers the immune cascade that can lead to autoimmune disease. The second part of it is some of these inflammatory triggers like LPS can actually be the key that starts a process called the bystander effect that creates an autoimmune response to some body tissue. So take rheumatoid arthritis, for example, right? There was a person that asked about that. If you get a bunch of LPS that floods through into your system because your gut is leaky, you've got too much gram-negative bacteria and so on, the LPS is very pervasive. It can make its way into your joints. When it gets into your joints, it triggers an inflammatory response in your joints because your immune system sees it as a severe toxin. So when your innate immune system shows up and it starts attacking that area, it's essentially attacking your joints. Now, what is supposed to happen is your innate immune response shifts towards your adaptive immune response, which is the antibody-based response. But part of the innate immune response is trying to show the adaptive system what the trigger was that it's fighting. Right. So if it's a virus, it's trying to find the virus, grab viral particles and show it to your adaptive immune system so that your adaptive immune system can make antibodies against that virus. If it's a bacteria, it tries to do the same thing. If it's a toxin, it tries to do the same thing. But when you have massive amounts of inflammatory damage, what can happen is your innate immune system can accidentally pick up your own tissue and present it to the adaptive immune system as the trigger or as the target for the infectious problem. And so that's how your adaptive immune system accidentally starts making antibodies against your own tissue. It's called the bystander effect because your own tissue is a bystander, is an innocent bystander in that inflammatory battle.
Yeah.
Right. So keep that in mind. Now, LPS can trigger all of that in your system. So now your own tissue is accidentally the bystander. Now, your immune system has a regulatory component that is designed to identify these accidental exposures and suppress them. That's called a Treg system. The problem, however, is when your microbiome is messed up and you have too much gram-negative bacteria and you have leaky gut and all that, the Treg system is not working properly.
Right.
So the monitors of this kind of erroneous immune response are also not working when you have high levels of LPS. So it's a perfect storm of things that allows your immune system to start to go haywire and attack your own tissue. So if you can reduce that perfect storm, if you can reduce that continuous flooding in of LPS, that inflammatory cascade, the bystander effect, it gives your body a chance to start catching up, to figure out which immune responses it should be eliciting and which ones it shouldn't. Right.
I thought it was really fascinating because we teach a lot about fatty liver in our program, and fatty liver is huge. I mean, every single person with autoimmune disease have some form of fatty liver to some degree, period.
Yep.
I thought it was really fascinating because for me, one of the number one triggers for fatty liver for those with autoimmune disease that I found is blood sugar fluctuations. So when people go from high to low, that insulin really turns that sugar into fat, which is stored in the liver. So blood sugar is one of the major triggers of fatty liver. Why do we care about fatty liver? Is because your liver is your major detoxification organ that breaks things down. So if you have if you have a ton of LPS, we really need our liver to actually help break it down.
Yeah,
But
more than 85% of the LPS that leaks into your body is supposed to be sequestered by the liver. If your liver is not functioning properly, more of it is going to go into circulation, which means that more of it is around in your body to trigger inflammatory responses all over.
And so the thing is that the first step, like a lot of LPS, is coming from your gut. And then you talk about bystander organ. What happens to circulation? Where does the LPS first go? What's the first bystander that gets hit? And that's the bystander we need. Go for it.
Yes, it's the liver. First it's going to hit the lining of the gut, right? The intestinal cells themselves. And in fact, the intestinal cells themselves can get inflammatory bystander effect. You see this in conditions like Crohn's colitis, right? These are autoimmune type of responses where now the bystander damage has occurred on the intestinal cells themselves. So now you've got your immune system attacking your own intestinal cells. That's the first area in which you get massive amounts of LPS exposure and bystander effect. Then the next area is through the liver as well, because if it leaks through, it's going mostly to the liver. From there, it can make its way all over the body, the brain, the heart, the joints, virtually everywhere. It can trigger immune responses. Here's the other thing. Point out one more thing. So when your gut is leaky and you're allowing lots of LPS to leak through, studies also show that pathogenic bacteria can themselves leak through and make their way into the mesenteric lymph nodes, which are attached to the digestive tract. And when they get into the mesenteric lymph node, they can trigger systemic lupus. That's actually one of the processes in which lupus starts to develop.
Exactly. And I mean, I love what you actually even said was that we're 2 millimeters away from colon cancer.
Yeah.
I love talking about that particular study. I think that study to me demonstrates just how big of a deal this infection, this LPS soup we're talking about, contributes to something like cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there was a big study on cancer itself, looking at what is the biggest predictor of mortality and prognosis in cancer. And they found elevated LPS levels was the best predictor of whether or not you're going to develop mortality and what your prognosis was in cancer. 60% at least of cancer mortality has to do with LPS and the resulting inflammation and cachexia that it causes in the body. That's that wasting syndrome, right? So absolutely, if you look at the work that Dr. Fasano has done at Harvard, they always talk about, the triangle or the triad of autoimmune disease. One of the things, that they always talk about is some sort of environmental trigger. And LPS and leakiness in the gut is known to be one of those environmental triggers that can start the cascade and start the process off in the body.
Yeah, I think about how we have a question here from Andrea and says, do you test for LPS in the 5 Pillars program? So interestingly, it's not so easy to test for LPS.
Yeah.
We actually see the results of LPS everywhere in autoimmune disease. And the most important thing is people keep attacking it from, I need to deal with this infection. What we do is actually the Transform program completely changes the environment that allows the bacteria to thrive that generate LPS.
That's exactly right, and unfortunately, there's no easy test for LPS. I saw another question come through. If you get test for it in saliva and so on,
Right.
it's not in research. In the research environment, you can test for it. We have the right equipment and all to do that. But here's the thing: remember, everybody has gram-negative bacteria in the system.
Right.
Everybody makes LPS. If you have an autoimmune condition, your gut is absolutely leaky. You absolutely have an overgrowth of these types of organisms. So you can just presume you have an elevation of LPS.
What the hell? Yes.
Right? And deal with it that way, because there's also no harm in any of the therapeutics or processes or diets that you can think of that help you with LPS, right? It's only going to help. So you can make a presumption that, you know what, I need to focus on LPS as part of my healing journey and add in the therapeutics and so on that you need to deal with it.
So here's the thing, Kiran, we went through a lot. We went full circle. I mean, we went all the way, started with what is LPS, and we ended this with what does LPS have to do with autoimmunity. And I mean, I think for the lay public, this is a lot of high level teaching and training that you just heard that confound physicians. Physicians have a hard time learning what you just heard today.
Yeah.
And so for me, the big takeaway, what is the big takeaway? And I think is what Kiran just said, which is that, of course, you have a shit ton of LPS if you have autoimmunity, and so much time, money is wasted on further diagnostics to figure out if I have elevated LPS, do I have infection or not? When I'm like, cut the crap that doesn't work, let's fix the environment, which is what the 5 pillars of transform is about. And so people said, do your 5 pillars really talk about, does your 5 pillars address LPS, the role of LPS in autoimmune disease? 100% yes. And to learn what the 5 pillars are, type 5 pillars in chat right now, and we will have our team get the 5 pillars training to you. But Kiran, let's just looking at the 5 pillars. Number 1 is going to be hormone balancing, which has a lot to do with liver and large intestinal bacteria and liver, right? Number 2, we're talking about blood sugar mastery, which has to do with what's feeding those organisms. Number 3, you're talking about vitamin and nutrient density, which has a lot to do with digestion and the absorption of key nutrients, right? And then number 4, you're going to be talking about gut healing in the right order. And that's the problem, is people think gut healing comes first. And to me, it's a result of doing those 1, 2, 3 first, and then you get to number 4.
Totally, yeah.
And then I'm missing a number 5, and I'm just blanking out at the moment. But to find out what those 5 pillars are, I would definitely put 5 pillars in chat, and our team will get that to you. Kiran, if you had one biggest takeaway for people about LPS and autoimmunity, what is something, number 1, that they can I don't know if you want to do 1 or you want to do 3 things.
Yeah, I could come up with 3, I'm sure.
Come up with 3. I love 3s, and I could also come up with 3 also if I have anything to add. What are the 3 most crucial things people with autoimmune disease should do to reduce their LPS?
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So number 1, I think getting diversity back into your diet is going to be critical, right? So going through the food mapping process, understanding the food triggers, understanding what foods you can put back into your diet, and then making a very specific plan to get those foods back into your diet and diversify your gut microbiome is going to be absolutely critical, because that diverse gut microbiome is going to control a lot of these infectious and LPS-borne microbes into your system. Number 2, utilizing the spore-based probiotics. We've published studies showing that just 30 days of the megaspore, for example, completely stops and reduces LPS from translocating or migrating into circulation. So it's a very powerful tool for stopping LPS from getting through into your system. And then number 3, you have to clean up some of those other lifestyle components, the pillars that you were just talking about, Maggie, the pillars like getting blood sugar control, micronutrient density, those types of things that you can start to do to improve the ecosystem and the terrain of your body. Because without paying attention to those things, the terrain gets dismantled. And the moment there's a dismantling of terrain, egregious microbes start to take over, right? There's no balance in the system. And so you have to do those things. It's not a magic pill. It takes a little bit of effort. You're not going to see results just overnight, but it's foundational, meaning that results, when they come, they last forever.
Well, that's why I mean, Kiran, that's why we call the program Transform Fundamentals program.
Yeah,
Like these are the fundamentals that are transformational. And people don't focus on fundamentals. They don't focus on the environment. And
yeah.
we have Elisa who's in the program, talking the pillar I missed the missed out of the 5 pillars was food mapping.
Oh, right.
How did I miss food mapping? Um, I'm sick. So I can only associate it with brain fog being sick. But that was your number one, which was we need diversity in our food. And the only way you're going to get diversity in our food is to get accurate data for food mapping. So you know what to put back in
Yeah.
versus the nutrient, depleted elimination diet, small group of food that you're currently eating. So yeah, food mapping is really key, and accurate food mapping, not more, over the counter, or mail-in order food tests, or providers who don't understand these results in people with autoimmunity. So that's the difference with food mapping. If you're interested in getting more information about food mapping, type the word food mapping in chat, and we will get you some training videos specifically around our unique process for food mapping. Perfect. So I think that's a wrap. That was a big 3 of what to do. And thank you to everybody for all these questions around this. I really, Kiran, thank you so much for coming on and really doing a mind blow around LPS for our audience.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It was wonderful to see you at the conference. When was that? A couple months ago.
Yeah.
I think, and we'll continue on our mission to go after LPS and improve gut health. And thank you for your mission for transforming people's health, because these foundations, these pillars, are so critical for people to make permanent change. So it's great to be able to talk on this subject. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And if you wanted to learn more about the Transform program, there is a link in chat for you to book a chat with our team. Thanks, everybody.